Welcome to the debate. There are certain moments in history that feel less like a progression and more like a precipice. We stand, I believe, at one such edge today. The machinery of global diplomacy, once humming with the reassuring, if sometimes inefficient, rhythm of consensus, it has fallen silent. Quite. And in its place, we hear the grinding gears of something far older and far more dangerous, which is the unchecked assertion of raw power. To understand this terrifying quiet, we are turning today to a piece of writing that is as much a lament as it is a masterclass in geopolitical analysis. We are dissecting The Conscience of a World on Edge by the writer Samiullah Malik.
It is a text of remarkable weight. I will certainly grant you that. Samiullah Malik has penned a treatise here that cuts right through the noise of the daily news cycle to really expose the skeletal structure of the current crisis between the United States and Iran. But while you hear the grinding gears of a dangerous regression, I hear the mechanics of a necessary realignment. Malik describes a world where the soft cadences of diplomacy are being drowned out, yes. But the core question we must grapple with today is whether that drowning is a tragedy or simply the inevitable result of a diplomatic architecture that has become, frankly, too weak to hold back the tide of reality.
Well, that is the cynical view, and it's one I intend to dismantle today. The central thesis Samiullah Malik presents is not merely about a shift in strategy, it is about a collapse of conscience. He asks us to consider whether the silence of the international community, the peaceable nations as he calls them, represents a moral culpability. We are witnessing, according to Malik, the dismantling of international law, where the United Nations is reduced to an ornamental seal, and where a unipolar dispensation seeks to define rights solely by the weight of its military might.
And I intend to challenge that premise entirely. I believe Malik's essay actually provides us with all the evidence we need to see this not as a collapse, but as an evolution of statecraft. The silence he mourns might well be the pragmatic quiet required for the real work to be done. We are seeing a move away from public, performative ethics toward what Malik brilliantly identifies as temporal compression, a high-stakes, high-pressure mode of negotiation. But before we get into those mechanics, let's start with the atmosphere Malik establishes. He begins with the silence.
He does, and it is a haunting beginning. Samiullah Malik writes, "There are turning points in history at which the silence of nations becomes not merely a lapse, but a culpability." He contrasts our current moment with the past. He evokes the ghosts of the multitudes who filled the streets to protest the wars in Vietnam and Iraq. And he asks, where are they now? The essay argues that the heavy drapery of state, this complex, insulating fabric of modern governance and economic entanglement, has essentially suffocated the public conscience. We have retreated into a passive spectatorship.
It's a powerful image, I agree. The passive spectator. But let's analyze why that passivity exists. Malik suggests it is because the profit of the armaments industry and broad economic interests have superseded human life. That is your reading, that we have been bought off. I would argue, however, that the silence represents a realization by the public that the old ways of protest are obsolete in the face of the iron tread of military might, to use Malik's exact phrase. The public is not silent because they are complicit. They are silent because they understand that in a unipolar world, the decision-making process has become impervious to the noise of the street.
Impervious to the noise of the street. You say that as if it were a virtue of the system. This is exactly the feudalism of nations that Malik warns against. If the conscience of the world has no battalions, as you seem to imply, then we are no longer living in a civilization of laws. We are living in a jungle of interests. Malik points out that under the leadership described in the text, specifically the return of a distinct America First approach under Donald Trump, we are seeing a mode of politics that treats the United Nations not as a living forum for the arbitration of disputes, but as an obstacle to be bypassed. When you strip the UN of its function, you remove the only mechanism we have for resolving conflict through council rather than canon.
But we must be honest about the efficacy of that council. Malik describes the UN as becoming a ceremonial relic. My question to you is, who made it a relic? Was it the Americans bypassing it, or was it the institution's own historical paralysis? Malik writes that the vision of global equilibrium requires decisive levers. If the UN cannot pull those levers, then power naturally migrates to those who can. And this brings us to a critical concept in the essay, which is unipolarity.
Yes, let us define that clearly for the audience. Unipolarity refers to a distribution of power in which one state exercises most of the cultural, economic, and military influence. In Malik's analysis, the United States is acting as this singular pole, untethered by the checks and balances of a multipolar system, or indeed international institutions.
Precisely. And Malik gives us a very concrete example of this unipolarity in action, the Board of Peace. The text notes that this body was originally conceived for the conflict in Gaza, but its remit is now broadening. You see this as a sinister parallel diplomatic platform designed to exclude the world.
Because it is. It is fundamentally an exclusionary mechanism. Malik warns that the Board of Peace is essentially an American initiative designed to bypass global consensus. It is a workaround that delegates the fate of nations to a select few, rather than the collective wisdom of the international community. When you replace the General Assembly with a boardroom of hand-picked negotiators, you are not creating efficiency, you are destroying legitimacy. You are loosening a principal column of the international order.
Oris, you are finally creating a venue where a deal can actually be cut. The Board of Peace represents a shift from performative diplomacy to transactional diplomacy. Malik references the realpolitik of figures like Henry Kissinger. In that worldview, legitimacy comes from stability, not from universal participation. If the UN is a burning building where 193 tenants are arguing over who holds the hose, the Board of Peace is the fire department kicking down the door. It is undemocratic, perhaps, but Malik's essay forces us to ask a difficult question. Do we want a democratic process that leads to war, or an autocratic process that might force a peace?
That is a false dichotomy and, frankly, a dangerous seduction. Forcing a peace at the barrel of a gun is not peace. It is subjugation. And this brings us to what I find to be the most chilling part of Sami Ullah Malik's analysis, the grammar of power. He draws a stark, almost literary contrast between the language used by Tehran and the language used by Washington. It is a clash of civilizations, not in religion, but in legality.
You are referring to the invocation of Article 51.
I am, and we must explain this concept, because Malik places great weight on it. Article 51 of the UN Charter serves as the foundational legal exception to the prohibition on the use of force. It grants every nation the inherent right to individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs. Malik notes that Iran has formally communicated with the Secretary General, grounding its arguments in this language of legality and sovereign entitlement. They are attempting to secure a juridical warrant. They are playing by the rules of the book we all agreed to write after the Second World War.
And Washington is playing by the rules of the playground bully? Is that your assessment?
It is the assessment the text demands. Contrast Iran's legalism with the language from Washington. Malik cites vague threats of unspecified bad things. He cites ultimatums that lack any juridical grounding whatsoever. We are hearing the language of the mob boss, not the statesman. When one side cites the charter and the other side says you have 10 days or else, we have witnessed the death of the juridical framework. We are watching the rule of law be suffocated by the grammar of power.
I think you are being incredibly charitable to the Iranian position and incredibly dismissive of the American strategy. Malik himself admits that Iran's use of Article 51 is a strategic move to align itself with global public opinion. It is theater designed to secure a narrative advantage. But let's look at the American strategy Malik describes. He calls it temporal compression.
A very sterile term for a terrifying reality.
No, a precise term for negotiation tactic. Let's break it down. Temporal compression is the deliberate shortening of the decision-making window to induce psychological pressure. Malik notes that President Trump reportedly afforded Iran a fortnight, perhaps 10 days, to reach a meaningful agreement. In standard diplomacy, you have months, years even. By compressing that timeline, Washington is turning time into a weapon. Malik calls this a familiar device of psychological diplomacy. It creates a pressure chamber. My point is, the bad things threat isn't just thuggery. It is calculated ambiguity. It is designed to force a rational actor to choose survival over pride.
But you are assuming the actor remains rational while inside a pressure chamber. That is the fundamental flaw in your logic and the exact danger Malik highlights. He warns that words acquire the density of policy. This is a profound observation by Samiullah Malik. It means that rhetoric eventually solidifies into physical reality. If you keep telling the world that bad things will happen, eventually you have to do the bad things to maintain your credibility. You are painting yourself into a corner where war becomes the only way to save face.
That is the inherent risk of brinkmanship, yes.
It is not just a risk, it is a gamble with the lives of millions. Malik warns that a single spark could set the entire horizon alight. He notes that military action is not a theoretical construct here. He references reported strikes on nuclear facilities. He references the Iranian threat that all hostile power assets in the region are targets. This is not a board game. The vortex, as Malik calls it, creates a gravity that pulls everyone in. If that temporal compression fails, if the 10 days pass and Iran doesn't blink, what happens? The U.S. has boxed itself into a conflict it cannot rhetorically escape.
Unless the vortex is exactly where the deal gets made. You are focusing heavily on the public threats, the acrid scent of powder. But Malik's essay is sophisticated enough to look behind the curtain. He details the mechanics of the back channel. While the world is panicking over the headlines, the text explicitly mentions good meetings involving figures like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner with Iranian counterparts.
Private meetings held while missiles are being fueled. It is schizophrenic statecraft.
It is the pincer movement of modern power. Malik writes that discreet negotiations have at times achieved what public conferences could not. Why? Because confidentiality affords a freer hand. You cannot make monumental concessions on international television. You make them in a quiet room with Jared Kushner. The text suggests that the threat of war, the bad things, is the necessary backdrop to make those private meetings productive. The public belligerence is the stick. The Witkoff meetings are the carrot. You cannot have one without the other in this model of unipolar dispensation.
But this entirely relies on an assumption of perfect control. Samiullah Malik reminds us, and this is a historical truth we ignore at our peril, that world wars have seldom been born of grand design alone. They are born of accidents. They are born of sparks landing on dry grass. By playing this game of temporal compression and secret back channels, we are walking a razor's edge in a storm. Malik argues that by bypassing the Board of Peace, the UN, we have removed the safety net. If the Kushner talks fail, there is no international mediator left to step in because we have spent years delegitimizing them.
I would argue the safety net was already full of holes, but point taken. However, let's look at the desired outcome Malik points toward. He notes that White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt suggested it would be wise for Iran to conclude a deal. The goal is clearly a deal, not an invasion. The sword remains sheathed, as Malik puts it. The strategy is brinkmanship, undoubtedly, but the objective is a new equilibrium.
And yet, Malik asks, at what cost to the human soul? This is the core thesis we absolutely cannot ignore. He asks, where now stand the peaceable nations? He questions whether the profit of the armaments industry has acquired a value exceeding human life. This is not just about whether the strategy works, it is about what we become by employing it. If the only way we can maintain order is by threatening to incinerate our neighbors and entirely ignoring the rule of law, have we not failed the test of civilization? We are letting pride's intoxication defeat reason's light.
Reason's light is a beautiful phrase, and Malik uses it masterfully. But I must challenge the efficacy of that light in a dark room. The realist in me questions whether public outcry, the multitudes Malik misses, would actually change the calculus of a unipolar power. The text notes that the iron tread of military might operates on a logic that ignores sentiment. The peaceable nations are silent because they are largely irrelevant to this specific power dynamic. You asked where the multitudes are. Maybe they understand that in a unipolar dispensation, the opinion of the crowd matters far less than the decision of the autocrat. Malik frames this as a tragedy. I frame it as a reality check. The conscience of the world is a noble concept, but it has no battalions.
Then we are returning to might makes right. That is the perilous precedent Malik warns about. If we accept this reality check, we tell future generations that justice is a fairy tale and only power is real. Malik writes that if the Middle East smolders today, Europe and Asia may feel the heat tomorrow. This grammar of power isn't contained by geography. If we allow the UN to become a ghost town, we have no mechanism to stop the next conflict or the one after that. War does not respect cartography. The silence of nations is not prudence. It is a dereliction of duty.
It is a bleak picture, certainly. But let us look at the conclusion Sami Ullah Malik draws. He doesn't say war is strictly inevitable. He says the horizon remains veiled in mist.
He says the candle of peace is beset by gathering winds. It is an image of profound fragility.
Yes. But he also suggests that if prudence and sagacity gain the upper hand, the lamp might continue to burn. My reading is that the very pressure, the temporal compression, the bad things, the back-channel talks, is the attempt to force that prudence. It is a dangerous game, yes, but it might be the only game left when the polite papers of the UN have turned to ash.
Then it is a game that gambles with the soul of the world. Sami Ullah Malik ends with a challenge. Will we remain spectators? He writes that history will judge whether we stood by while the architecture of international peace was dismantled. It is a call for the awakening of the global conscience. He isn't saying the candle is out. He's saying we have to cup our hands around it.
And my reading is that the wind is blowing too hard for hands to matter. But perhaps that is where the debate must rest. Malik has provided us with a mirror reflecting our own fragility. We see a world where legal entitlement is battling psychological pressure and where the silence of the majority is frankly deafening.
Indeed, we have explored the depths of the conscience of a world on edge. Sami Ullah Malik has provided us not just with an analysis of the US-Iran tension, but with a severe warning about the fragility of our entire global order. Whether you view the silence of nations as a strategic necessity or a moral catastrophe, the stakes could not be higher.
It is a text that demands to be read and a reality that demands to be understood. We leave you with that image of the candle and the gathering winds. It is up to the listener to decide if the wind is trying to blow the flame out or if it is the only thing keeping the fire from spreading entirely.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through the corridors of power and the conscience of history. Our deepest gratitude to the writer Sami Ullah Malik for his profound contribution to this discourse.
Until next time.
This has been The Debate.